Imagine a ceasefire is signed tomorrow. Guns go silent. Missiles stop flying. Every news channel declares the war in the Middle East is over. And yet, your gas bill doesn't drop. Oil is still $120 a barrel. Tankers are still refusing to enter the water. The world is still choking on an energy crisis that the peace deal was supposed to fix. Here's what almost no one is telling you. The Strait of Hormuz, a 21-mile wide bottleneck that carries 20% of the world's entire oil supply, doesn't reopen just because the shooting stops. The damage isn't in the weapons. It's in something far harder to kill: fear. And fear, unlike a ceasefire, has no signature date. The Strait of Hormuz sits between Iran and Oman, a narrow channel so critical that energy economists have a specific term for it: a choke point. Every single day, roughly 17 to 21 million barrels of oil pass through it, loaded onto massive supertankers headed for Europe, Asia, and the United States. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, UAE, Kuwait, none of their oil reaches the world without passing through this 21-mile corridor. Now here's the structural problem that most news coverage completely ignores. The global shipping industry doesn't operate on politics. It operates on insurance, risk models, and actuarial tables. The moment a single tanker gets struck by a missile or a drone, insurance underwriters in London and Tokyo don't wait for a UN resolution. They reprice every vessel entering that water. Premiums spike. Shipping companies calculate the math. And the math right now says, don't go in. JP Morgan's head of global commodities didn't say the strait was closed. He said something more precise and more alarming. Tanker owners need to witness a sustained period without attacks before they return. That phrase, sustained period, is doing enormous work. It means weeks, possibly months. And it means the economic crisis outlives the conflict itself. The official narrative from governments and media goes something like this. Conflict escalates, oil prices rise, conflict ends, oil prices fall, life returns to normal. It's a clean, linear story, and it has worked before. After the Gulf War in 1991, shipping routes stabilized within weeks of a ceasefire. After the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, tanker traffic gradually recovered once the shooting stopped. So when politicians stand at podiums today and promise that resolving the conflict will bring energy prices down, they aren't lying from nowhere. They're borrowing from a historical playbook. But here is the critical flaw in that playbook. Those previous conflicts happened before the drone era. In 1991, disabling a supertanker required a naval vessel, trained personnel, and a significant military commitment, a high-cost, high-visibility act of war. Today, a drone that costs less than a used car can strike a vessel worth $100 million from 1,500 kilometers away, operated by a team of 3 people in an unmarked building. The threat geometry has permanently changed. And insurance markets, which move on data, not diplomacy, have already priced that change in. The official story says peace restores normalcy. The shipping industry's risk models say something different entirely. But if the official story is already broken, what's the truth the oil markets are actually pricing in? Because the real dirty secret of this crisis isn't the war. It's what happens the moment the war ends. Here is what the financial press buries in paragraph 14. Shipping insurance doesn't reset on a ceasefire, it resets on claims history. When underwriters at Lloyd's of London or the Japanese P&I Club reprice a war risk zone, they aren't watching CNN. They're running loss models based on actual vessel incidents over a rolling 12 to 36-month window. The Strait of Hormuz has accumulated a devastating claims history since 2019. Tanker seizures, limpet mine attacks, drone strikes, and missile near misses. That history doesn't vanish because 2 governments sign a document. It sits in the actuarial record and drives premiums for months, sometimes years, afterward. Right now, war risk insurance for a single voyage through the strait has increased by an estimated 300 to 500% compared to pre-conflict rates. That cost doesn't disappear overnight. It gets passed directly into the price of every barrel of oil on that tanker. And here is the second layer most people miss entirely. Even if premiums drop, the tanker captains themselves have veto power. Under international maritime law, a captain can refuse to enter waters they deem unsafe, regardless of what their employer, their government, or a peace treaty says. JP Morgan's analysis essentially confirmed what shipping insiders already knew. The human risk calculus, not the political one, is running this crisis now. So insurance won't reset, captains won't move, and premiums stay elevated. Fine, but what does that actually do to the real-world economy? The consequences are more specific and more brutal than most people realize. When oil sits at $120 a barrel for an extended period, it doesn't just raise gas prices, it triggers a specific economic chain reaction that central banks genuinely fear. Here's how it moves. Elevated oil prices feed directly into transport costs, which feed into food prices, which feed into core inflation. The US Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, and the Bank of England all watch energy prices as a leading inflation indicator. Meaning a sustained Hormuz disruption doesn't just hurt drivers, it forces interest rate decisions that affect every mortgage, every business loan, and every government debt payment on the planet. JP Morgan's own modeling suggests that oil at $120 per barrel sustained for 6 months could add 1.5 to 2 percentage points back onto US inflation, effectively erasing 2 years of the Fed's tightening work. But the consequence that receives almost no coverage is what happens to Asian economies specifically. Japan, South Korea, India, and China collectively import over 60% of their oil through the Strait of Hormuz. These aren't marginal consumers. They're the manufacturing backbone of the global economy. When their energy input costs spike, the price of every electronic, every vehicle component, and every piece of industrial equipment they export rises with it. The disruption doesn't stay in the Middle East. It reprices the cost of modern life globally with a lag of roughly 90 to 120 days. And this is the moment where the full picture snaps into focus. We're not dealing with an energy crisis that ends when the conflict ends. We're dealing with a system, insurance markets, maritime law, inflation mechanics, central bank policy, that was quietly rewired during the conflict and now runs on its own logic. The war was the trigger, but the crisis has become self-sustaining. A ceasefire doesn't switch off the insurance repricing. It doesn't override a captain's legal right to refuse entry. It doesn't unwind 36 months of claims history in Lloyd's actuarial models. It doesn't stop Asian manufacturing costs from rising or the Fed from responding to inflation it didn't cause. What started as a geopolitical conflict has embedded itself into the financial architecture of global trade, and that architecture does not have a peace treaty clause. And if you think that's the worst of it, there's one more layer to this. The impact most people will never see coming because it doesn't show up at the gas station. It shows up somewhere far more invisible. The hidden impact is in the rerouting math and what it permanently does to global shipping infrastructure. When tankers avoid the Strait of Hormuz, they don't simply stop. They take the alternative route around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa. That detour adds approximately 15 to 20 additional sailing days per voyage and burns roughly 300 additional metric tons of fuel per trip. Now multiply that across hundreds of tankers per month. The result is a massive, invisible tax on the global shipping system. More fuel consumed, more vessels tied up in transit, fewer ships available for other routes, and port congestion that cascades from Rotterdam to Singapore. But here is the impact that operates entirely beneath public awareness. Liquefied natural gas shipments. Unlike crude oil, LNG cannot simply reroute around Africa. The economics collapse entirely on longer routes because the fuel cost of the detour consumes the profit margin of the cargo itself. Europe, which spent 3 years aggressively rebuilding its LNG supply chains after the Russia-Ukraine war to reduce dependence on Russian pipeline gas, is now watching those same chains come under pressure again from a completely different direction. The countries that thought they had diversified their way to energy security are discovering that all roads, or rather, all shipping lanes, still run through 21 miles of water they do not control. Here is the single most important thing to understand about the Strait of Hormuz crisis. The world built a global economy with a single point of failure, and then spent decades pretending it didn't exist. Every trade agreement, every just-in-time supply chain, every energy diversification strategy, all of it was engineered around the quiet assumption that 21 miles of Iranian-bordered water would always remain passable. It wasn't naivety. It was the math of efficiency. Rerouting is expensive. Redundancy costs money. So the world optimized for the best-case scenario and called it a supply chain. What JP Morgan's analysis is really telling us, underneath the shipping data and the oil price projections, is that the bill for that optimization has arrived. And it will keep arriving, not just until the conflict ends, but until the insurance models reset, the captains return, the claims history ages out of the actuarial window, and the shipping lanes rebuild the one thing no ceasefire can manufacture on demand: trust. That process takes months, sometimes years. And every single day it takes, the price is paid not by the governments who created the crisis, but by ordinary people at the gas pump, in the grocery store, on their mortgage statement, who never once looked at a map and noticed how thin that strait really is.